Martin Luther King Jr. said on a number of occasions, paraphrasing the Boston Unitarian Theodore Parker, who preceded him by a century, that, quote, "the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice," end quote. A similar observation can be made about the right to vote in the United States. This right has a long history, but it bends toward increased access to the ballot. A simple observation will prove this point. When independence was declared on July 4, 1776, and when the Constitution was ratified in 1788, only white men 21 and older with real property, real estate, were allowed to vote. The electorate was thus composed of a small percentage of white men and a very small percentage of the population as a whole. Men 18 to 20 did not have the right to vote until the ratification of the 26th Amendment on July 1, 1971. Women did not have the right to vote until the 19th Amendment was ratified on August 8, 1920. African Americans were granted the franchise by the ratification of the 15th Amendment on February 3, 1870. And other excluded groups, such as, for example, Native Americans and Asian Americans, were enfranchised during the course of the 20th century without amending the Constitution. Today, everyone has the right to vote, with some notable exceptions, including, for example, people under the age of 18 and those who cannot meet residency requirements, and a couple of other instances. History is the study of change over time. The change in this case is from a voting population of perhaps 20% to one approaching 100%. Obscured by this fact is that the expansion of the franchise has not taken place in a straight line. It has had to fight powerful headwinds. In the words of the leading historian of the subject, Professor Alexander Kazar of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, the pattern of American democracy has always been accompanied by profound anti-democratic countercurrents. The history of suffrage is one of both expansion and contraction, of inclusion and exclusion, of shifts in direction and momentum at different places and at different times. Before discussing some of the reasons for this ebb and flow of the democratic impulse in the United States, one point must be made and one question asked. The point deals with the difference between the formal right to vote and the actual facts on the ground. Formally, for example, the 15th Amendment states, open quote, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." This amendment was a startling change from the situation prior to the Civil War. A number of states in the early Republic of the United States permitted free blacks to vote. By 1855, only 5 states permitted free African Americans to vote, and this accounted for only 4% of the nation's free black population. The federal government prohibited blacks from voting in the territories it controlled, and in the Dred Scott decision of 1857, the Supreme Court declared that blacks could not be citizens of the United States and that they had no rights which whites were bound to respect. In his first inaugural address in 1861, Abraham Lincoln backed an amendment to the Constitution which would have protected slavery in the states in which it already existed. The following year, he wrote to journalist Horace Greeley that, quote, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it," end quote. Obviously, slaves couldn't vote. The 15th Amendment became part of the Constitution a mere 8 years after the President of the United States made this statement. No one in 1857, when the Dred Scott decision was rendered, or in 1862, when Abraham Lincoln wrote that letter to Horace Greeley, would have predicted that in 1870, black men 21 and older would possess the right to vote. And for one brief, shining moment after the Civil War, black men could indeed vote. In 1867, as a result of the Reconstruction Acts, blacks voted in the South for the first time. U.S. Grant was elected president in 1868, in part thanks to hundreds of thousands of black votes. Not only did they vote, blacks were elected to political office. Mississippi, indeed, sent 2 black senators to Washington in the 1870s. The term of the second of these men, Blanche K. Bruce, expired in 1881. Not until 1967 did another African American, Edward Brooke of Massachusetts, obviously not a southern state, become a United States senator. 20 African Americans served in the House of Representatives after the Civil War. The last one, George H. White, left in 1901. Not until 1929 did another black man enter the House of Representatives, and he was a Northerner, Oscar the Priest from Chicago. It was only in 1973 that Southern blacks again entered the House of Representatives. The 15th Amendment was subverted by Southern whites. Their techniques included, among others, grandfather clauses, phony literacy tests, poll taxes, and various forms of intimidation all the way up to murder. By 1900, very few black people were casting votes in the 11 states that seceded to form the Confederacy in 1860 and 1861. The disenfranchisement of black voters in the South was no secret. Everyone knew about it. Nothing was done. It is one of the oddities and ironies of the history of American government that while some clauses of the Constitution, such as the right to bear arms in the Second Amendment, are revered as if they were fragments of the true cross, others, such as the 15th Amendment, are openly violated for decades. Indeed, down to the present day, there are efforts made to keep black people from the polls. Let us now turn to women's suffrage. The unequal status of women in American society was well known at the time of the Declaration of Independence. Abigail Adams wrote to her husband John on March 31st, 1776, quote, "In the new code of laws which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies. Do not put such unlimited powers into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could." Abigail Adams was right, but then was entirely ignored. It would take almost a century and a half for women's suffrage to be acted upon. As is so often the case with the history of the right to vote, the story of women's suffrage is not a straight line from its denial to its incorporation into the polity. In New Jersey, for example, the state constitution of 1776 enfranchised all adult inhabitants with property. Laws referenced, quote, "he and she," end quote, and women regularly voted. But that right was taken away from them in 1807. The Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, the first women's rights convention, witnessed disagreement among the attendees about the advocacy of women's suffrage, but the demand for it, heavily supported by, among others, the great African-American escaped slave Frederick Douglass, was included in the convention's Declaration of Sentiments, which was modeled on the Declaration of Independence. The sentiments included in the Declaration were, first, that men, quote, "had not ever permitted her," that is, women, "to exercise her unalienable right to the elective franchise. He," that is, man, "has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she had no voice, having deprived her of the first right as a citizen, the elective franchise, thereby leaving her without representation in the halls of legislation. He has opposed her on all sides," close quote. Frederick Douglass, who believed that all reforms go together, was an ardent proponent of women's rights. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and Susan B. Anthony, the foremost advocates of women's rights before the Civil War, were ardent abolitionists. After the Civil War, however, the two reform movements split. Stanton was outraged that neither the 14th nor the 15th Amendments to the Constitution gave the vote to women. In one unfortunate meeting in New York City, which must have been very difficult in 1869, she asked rhetorically, open quote, "Shall American statesmen so amend their Constitution as to make their wives and mothers the political inferiors of unlettered and unwashed ditch diggers, bootblacks, butchers, and barbers fresh from the slave plantations of the South?" She also used derogatory terms about African Americans, such as Sambo. Douglas was on the platform with Stanton and rose to respond. He began by praising her for her years of work for civil rights for all. He then said, and these words are worth listening to carefully, open quote, "When women, because they are women, are hunted down through the cities of New York and New Orleans, when they are dragged from their houses and hung from lampposts, when their children are torn from their arms and their brains bashed out upon the pavement, when they are the objects of insult and rage at every turn, when they are in danger of having their homes burnt down, then they will have an urgency to obtain the ballot equal to our own." To be sure, Frederick Douglass favored universal suffrage, but convinced that this was, quote, "the Negro's hour," end quote, he was willing to accept the 15th Amendment as written. His eloquent reply to Stanton shows dramatically, but does not overstate, what was at stake for black suffrage. Women's suffrage would have to wait years before it became law. Indeed, the variety of arguments raised against it, which seem crazy to the modern ear, might not have been successfully overcome had it not been for America's entry into World War I on April 6, 1917. The war gave women the opportunity to contribute to mobilization, thereby overcoming the argument that women shouldn't vote because they did not bear arms. Addressing Congress in January 1918, President Woodrow Wilson supported the 19th Amendment, quote, "as a war measure," close quote. The amendment made it through Congress after a lot of pressure in 1919, but it still had to be ratified by 36 states. There were 48 states in the Union at the time. That formally happened in August of 1920, when the amendment squeaked through the Tennessee legislature by one vote. There is a very big difference between the 15th and 19th Amendments, which deserves to be highlighted. Blacks were robbed of the right to vote for a century in the South. A century after the 15th Amendment giving them that right was passed and ratified. Even today, roadblocks are put between black people and the ballot box, and not in the South alone. For women, in stark contrast, there was never any serious effort to render nugatory the results of the 19th Amendment. There was no turning back. Why the difference? Although no one could be certain beforehand, it turned out that doubling the size of the electorate in 1920 did not change much. Republican and Democratic strongholds remained as they were. Women indeed voted in lower percentages than men in the early years anyway. We should note that black women were denied the franchise just as black men were. They were not affected by the 19th Amendment. The situation with the 15th Amendment was altogether different. Blacks were going to vote for the party of Lincoln. Democrats had fought a war to keep them enslaved, and Republicans had fought not at first, but eventually to free them. There were black majorities in certain parts of the South, and blacks were close to a majority in a number of southern states. Thus, Republicans took 6 states of the old Confederacy in 1868 and again in 1872, and they took 3 in 1876. Without the black vote, this would not have happened. From 1880 through 1952, Republicans took only occasional southern states in a presidential election. The solid South, quote unquote, was solidly Democratic at the presidential level every 4 years for well over half a century after blacks were robbed of the vote. In addition, racism became, if anything, more virulent after the Civil War than before. Lynchings became commonplace in the South. There were over 3,000 of them. The convict leasing system has actually been described credibly as worse than slavery. Whites mercilessly exploited blacks as groups only exploit those they hate and have wronged. Frederick Douglass's response to Elizabeth Cady Stanton was accurate. A lot was at stake. Black people lost. The price for them and for the nation was dreadfully high. Early in this talk, I observed that a point had to be made about the franchise and a question had to be asked. The point is that there has been an ebb and flow in access to the franchise. Now to the question. After so much effort has been expended to enlarge the franchise, given that the great black intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois described the ballot as a, quote, visible sign of freedom, end quote, for blacks, and that Elizabeth Cady Stanton had called it an inalienable right for women, why has the participation of people with the right to vote been so low in the United States? From 1912 to 2016, turnout in presidential years as a percentage of voting age population has varied from a high of about 63% to a low of 49%. According to a major research organization, the United States ranked 26th out of 32 nations in the OECD for participation in elections. Why, with so much historically at stake, do so few people vote in the United States? Voter participation rates in the 19th century were higher in presidential years. In fact, they peaked at 81.2% in 1860 and again at 81.8% in 1876. These were both hotly contested elections. The outcomes would have immediate and knowable consequences. In contrast to those races, the racist former governor of Alabama, George Wallace, ran a third-party campaign for the presidency, making famous his slogan that, quote, there is not a dime's worth of difference between the two major parties, end quote. Nobody would have said that in 1860 or in 1876. Moreover, the voting participation and the whole nature of campaigning had changed fundamentally between, say, 1876 and 1976. Because in presidential elections, unless they live in a handful of swing precincts and a handful of swing states, it doesn't. They are correct. What renders the vote meaningless outside the swing states is the Electoral College. Government, according to the Declaration of Independence, derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. I mean, that, by the way, is why authoritarian dictatorships, such as the one in Russia, have elections. They're jokes, but they give the appearance of the consent of the governed. That's how powerful that idea is. In the United States, citizens do not elect the president. Electors do. Who are these electors? According to Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, quote, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislators thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress, end quote. I bet that not one person in the country could name the electors his or her state sends to Washington to elect the president. The Electoral College, a phrase, by the way, that does not appear in the Constitution, is an institution that means that a citizen's vote is imprisoned within the state in which it is cast. If you voted for Hillary Clinton in Alabama or for Donald Trump in California, your vote didn't count. So unimportant is the popular vote that there is not even a formal tabulation of it by the federal government. Because of our presidential selection system, candidates each 4 years campaign almost exclusively not in big states, not in small states, but in swing states. And because we live in an era of perpetual campaigning, Donald Trump filed papers for the 2020 campaign on January 20, 2017, which is the day he was inaugurated for his first term, a gesture that, by the way, is inconceivable to imagine George Washington to have made. Campaigning equals governing. If you live in a swing congressional district within a swing state, the president and Congress will give you more attention, for example, for infrastructure projects, than if you do not. What all this means is that if your vote does not count, you do not count. You are robbed of part of your citizenship. If a way could be found to make the popular vote, rather than the electoral vote, determine the winner of the presidential election, candidates would campaign in every state. Democratic votes in Mississippi and Republican votes in California would matter in presidential elections. Turnout would soar. It has been estimated that literally tens of millions more Americans might vote under such a circumstance. And Lincoln's dream, so eloquently and unforgettably expressed at Gettysburg, of a nation of the people, by the people, for the people, would be realized.